Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Schuylkill Saturday. My name is Aaliyah, and I'm the Director of Education at the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education. And today we are going to be talking all about lichens. Now, what is a lichen? Even if you're not sure what exactly a lichen is, I can just about guarantee that everybody has seen a lichen before. Now, there's many different types of lichens. They have a variety of growth forms and shapes and colors. But one of the most common forms of lichen is just something that looks like this, okay? You've probably seen it on a tree branch or on some tree bark, on a rock, or on a bench or some other kind of man-made object. But it just kind of looks like a greenish, grayish growth. It might actually have some pieces that come off the surface of the bark, or it might look something more like this, which is a lot closer to the actual substrate, okay? So this is lichen, and just about everybody has seen something like this before, either in the forest or somewhere in the city. And so what is this stuff? What exactly is lichen? And the really cool thing about lichen is that it's considered a composite organism. And a composite organism is really two different types of life, two different types of organisms living together in one body. And a composite organism like lichen is a really extreme form of a type of relationship called a symbiosis. And a symbiosis is essentially when two organisms live in really close association with one another. So I'm going to step aside for a moment from the topic of lichens and talk a little bit about relationships between organisms. There's many different ways that organisms can interact with one another. There are predator-prey relationships. There are parasitic relationships where one organism lives inside of and sort of feeds off of another organism. And this type of relationship that lichens exhibit is called a mutualism or symbiosis. And the specific type of symbiosis is a mutualism where both organisms benefit. So a lichen is actually composed of two or sometimes even three organisms. And the components of a lichen are a fungus and something called a photobiont, okay? So that's a big word. A photobiont is a type of the partner in a symbiosis that photosynthesizes. So it produces energy from the sun to feed itself in the same way that plants do. And the photobiont in a lichen relationship can either be an algae or it can be a cyanobacterium, which is also sometimes called blue-green algae, even though it's a bacteria. So lichens are composed of a fungus, a photobiont, which might be an algae or may sometimes be a bacteria, and sometimes algae or sometimes lichen can also have a third partner in the relationship, a yeast. So it's a really interesting thing when you think about it. What you're looking at when you're looking at lichen is two and sometimes three organisms living in close association with one another. Why do they do that? What is the evolutionary purpose for living together in the way that fungus and bacteria and algae do in lichens? The way that these organisms benefit from one another is that the fungus partner in the relationship provides structure. It provides stability. So the fungus parts of the lichen will latch on to a substrate, in this case a tree branch, and it will provide structure and it will provide protection from the elements for the photobiont. So if we're talking about algae, that algae is going to take energy from the sun and use it to create food that feeds itself and also the fungus partner. So the algae or cyanobacteria is getting shelter and protection from the fungus, and the fungus is getting food essentially through photosynthesis from the algae or the bacteria. So it's a really mutually beneficial relationship that you see in lichen. So let's see. where can you find lichen? Lichen can be found just about anywhere. So the next time that you go outside, you go to the Schuylkill Center or you go to a park or a walk in your neighborhood, just take the time to look around and see how many lichen you notice. Lichen are not only on tree branches and on tree bark, but they're also on rocks. They're on man-made objects like benches and fences and bridges and things like that. Lichen cover about 8% of the world's surface, which is amazing when you really think about it. 8% of the world's surface is covered by lichen. Lichen range from the poles to the tropics. They're on mountaintops and they're also in the intertidal zones on the shores. They're on all continents and they're on all biomes, and so they're really, really diverse, and they're very able to adapt to their environment. So what kinds of lichen are you likely to find out there? There's 3 major types of lichen, and they're based on the body form of the lichen, what it actually looks like. So one type of lichen is called fruticose. Fruticose because they are fruit-like. And when we say fruit-like, we're actually talking about a part of the lichen that actually extends up from the substrate, sort of like a mushroom does. So I don't actually have any examples of fruticose lichen to show you today, but I do have some pictures of some. Okay, so one type of fruticose lichen that you may have seen is something called reindeer moss or reindeer lichen. So if you are walking in a forest usually, and you happen upon something on the soil that looks kind of like this, here's a picture of it. It's kind of grayish green when you look at it from a distance. I think I've also got a close-up picture of what it looks like. So you can see it's kind of made up of these structures that are kind of similar to maybe deer antlers or the branching that you see in other forms of plants. But it's kind of called reindeer moss, I think, because it can kind of look like moss. And I also believe it's a source of food for elk and deer in certain habitats. So that's reindeer moss. That's one type of fruticose lichen. And I have a picture of another type of fruticose lichen that you might see, that you may have seen before. This is a close-up. It's actually not this big in reality. It's rather small, so you'll see this pretty close to the ground. It's no more than an inch or 2 tall usually. This is called British soldier lichen. One of the reasons I like lichen names is because they're named after things that they look like. So reindeer moss, you know, it kind of looks like moss, and it looks like the branching that you see on reindeer antlers. British soldier lichen is called that because the tops are red, so kind of reminiscent of the coats and the helmets that British soldiers used to wear. So this is British soldier lichen. And another type of fruticose lichen that you'll sometimes see is called old man's beard. Okay, so what does it look like? It kind of looks like an old man's beard. Okay, it's kind of long and branchy, and this is old man's beard that it looks like it's on a tree that also has some other lighter lichen on it. Okay, so those are examples of fruticose lichen. Now, another type of lichen is foliose lichen. Foliose meaning it's leaf-like. And so this is lichen that kind of looks like this. So the example that I showed earlier, this is an example of foliose lichen. So it's called foliose lichen because, like leaves, it's made of lobes. Okay, so you can see that it's kind of, it's made of, the edges rounded, and they're shaped in a way that is reminiscent of the lobes of a leaf on a tree. Okay, so that's foliose lichen. And another type of lichen that's probably tends to be more common in the city, in most urban areas of the city anyway, is crustose lichen. So crustose is crust-like. And this is a type of lichen that really appears as a crust over a substrate. So I have a picture of some crustose lichen. This is lichen that is on a couple of rocks, and you can see it kind of has this appearance that might kind of look like mold on an object. Okay, that is crustose lichen. And you'll see crustose lichen not only on tree branches, so I think I have a branch here that has a little bit of crustose on it. So you can see this really sort of green crust right here. This is an example of crustose lichen, and we'll get a close-up look under the microscope in just a moment. You're also going to find crustose lichen on things like benches or bridges. So basically flat surfaces that get sunlight at some form of day, eventually lichen will colonize it. So let's take a close-up look at some lichens. I'm gonna take Alright, so I have set up here a couple of magnifying instruments. So here's sort of a close-up look Folio Slicing, okay, and you can see it's got quite a bit of detail on it. It looks like it even has some little yellow nodules on it. Let's take a little bit closer look under this field microscope. So what I've got under here is actually a different piece of lichen, and I put this one under here. Let's see if I can get this a little bit better. Let's see, where's that camera? Okay. There we go. Alright, so you can see this lichen. This is not working as well as I had hoped. Okay, there we go. So you can see those little black hairs on the lichen. Okay, that's something that you really can't get a good look at unless you look at it under the scope. But you can see it's got these little black hairs all over it. Pretty neat. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Okay, so this one actually did not have a lot of luck getting it off of the branch, so we're going to look at it on the branch. So let's take a look at it first here under this magnifying glass. So you can see it just kind of looks like a lot of the other lichens that we were looking at before. Okay, this branch actually has lots of different types of lichen on it, and I can see that because once I put it on under the scope, let's see. Set this down for just a second. Hold on. You can, whoops. You can see that it's got these little black cups. Okay, let's see if I can get that in there. Okay. Well, unfortunately, as well as I hoped it would, but let's see if I can get a little bit closer with this. Oh, that's actually not too bad. So you may notice that really up close, black cups, the surface of it. And when you look at lichen really closely, it looks like micro. So I want to point. Let me try to do it like right here. All right, so I want to point out that on this branch, we're looking at lots of different types of lichen. Okay, there's not just one type of lichen on here, and not only are we seeing lichen, but we're also seeing moss. So that really bright green stuff that you kind of see on the edge of that branch, whoops, that bright green stuff is moss. And so moss and lichen are often studied together, not because they're anything alike in terms of phylogeny or evolution, but because they oftentimes live in the same habitats and on the same substrates. So you'll often see moss and lichen on the same tree branch or on the same patch of soil, living in close association with one another, although moss are much closer to traditional vascular plants than lichen are, of course. Okay, so I'm going to switch this camera back around. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that in the city, especially in parts of the city that are far away from the forest, you're most likely to see crustose lichen. And the reason for that is lichen is very, very sensitive to air quality. So lichen have been used in studies of air pollution. So the way that scientists have sort of noticed how it works is that the more surface area of the lichen that's exposed to the air, the more sensitive it is to pollutants in the air. So, for example, Folio Slicing, or rather fruticose lichen, fruticose lichen, like the British soldier lichen, for example, that has a lot of surface area coming out off of the substrate and exposed to the air, is really sensitive to air pollution. And so if you're in an area that has a lot of reindeer moss or a lot of old man's beard or other types of fruticose lichen, that's generally an indicator of good air quality. And you're going to see foliose lichen that has a little bit less surface area exposed is going to be a little bit less sensitive to air quality, to differences in air quality. You're going to see foliose lichen, they're a little bit less sensitive, and so they can withstand higher levels of pollution than fruticose lichen can. And if you're in an area that tends to have a higher level of air pollution, like most cities do, probably more commonly we'll see crustose lichen, because it's lichen that's very, very close to the substrate that it lives on, not as exposed to the air. And so that's why I mentioned here in the you're going to probably see crustose lichen more frequently than you would see other types of lichen. So the next time that you go out, whether it's at the Schuylkill Center or anywhere else in the city, I challenge you to take a look around and take note of how much lichen you see. And you can even make it a little contest for yourself. Take pictures of lichen that you see and just try to see how many different forms of lichen you notice. You'll probably also see, as I mentioned, moss and those types of plants living right alongside that lichen. You can take a picture of kind of all of it together. So, if you happen to get a piece of bark off of a tree, maybe not a piece of bark that's off of a live tree, but one that's already falling off, or maybe a branch that's on the ground, or a small rock that has lichen on it, and you're able to take a look at it under a microscope or under a magnifying glass, you'll notice that there's so many different features that you wouldn't see just looking at it with the naked eye. So it's definitely a interesting thing to take a close look at, and a cool way to experience nature and to interact with nature. So in the comments, I'm going to be putting a link that will send you to a website where you can learn more about lichen and more about observing lichen and learning about how we can use lichen to determine the air quality around us. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your weekend. Get outdoors, even though it's going to be really hot, so make sure that you stay hydrated. Get outdoors and see what kinds of lichen you can find, and make sure to join us next Saturday for Schuylkill Saturdays. And hope you guys enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next time.